7 signs you've healed more than you realize. Vertical bar, Carl Jung's deepest wisdom. You think you're still broken, but what if you've already healed more than you realize? Because real healing isn't loud. It doesn't come with applause or miracles. It shows up quietly when you stop chasing peace and start feeling it. Carl Jung said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." So if you've suffered, faced yourself, and still found love inside the silence, this video will show you the 7 signs that your soul has already healed, even if your mind hasn't noticed yet. Part 1. Healing begins in the unconscious. Most people think healing is about forgetting the past, forgiving those who hurt them, or moving on to a new chapter of life. But Carl Jung would say that true healing doesn't begin with forgetting. It begins with remembering, confronting, and integrating what lies beneath the surface. Healing, in Jung's view, starts in the unconscious, not in the conscious mind that wants quick solutions or easy peace. The unconscious, as Jung described it, is not just a dark basement of repressed memories. It's a living, dynamic force, a hidden ecosystem of images, emotions, fears, and potentials that shape who we are. Within it lie both the wounds that formed us and the energies that can heal us. Jung believed that every neurosis, every recurring emotional pain, is not just an illness, it's a message from the unconscious calling us to awaken. When you begin to heal more than you realize, the first sign isn't that life feels easier, it's that you can finally face your inner world without denial. You start to see what you've been running from all along. The pain that once terrified you becomes something you can observe. The triggers that once sent you spiraling become moments of awareness. That subtle shift from being controlled by your inner wounds to witnessing them with presence marks the true beginning of healing. The descent into the shadow. Jung's concept of the shadow is the cornerstone of inner healing. The shadow is everything we refuse to acknowledge about ourselves. The anger, jealousy, fear, shame, selfishness, or even the unexpressed strength and power we've buried. It is both the darkness we fear and the light we've never dared to own. For Jung, confronting the shadow was not a punishment, it was liberation. The moment we stop projecting our darkness onto others, blaming them for what we cannot face in ourselves, we reclaim the lost pieces of our psyche. We begin to recognize that the enemy outside often mirrors the disowned aspects within. This is why Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." When you can look at your anger without shame, when you can name your envy or bitterness and still hold compassion for yourself, you are already healing. You're breaking the pattern of repression that feeds suffering. The shadow isn't something to destroy, it's something to integrate. Integration means that you stop rejecting parts of yourself. You allow the full spectrum of who you are to exist in your awareness. And paradoxically, that's what brings peace. Because the war within you ends when you stop trying to kill parts of your own soul, awakening the inner observer. In analytical psychology, Jung often emphasized the birth of the inner observer, the ability to step back and see oneself from a higher level of consciousness. This isn't dissociation or detachment. It's awareness. When you begin to heal, you develop a kind of inner distance, not coldness but clarity. You no longer drown in your emotions. Instead, you witness them like waves passing through your being. You might still feel sadness, but it no longer defines your identity. You might still feel anger, but you understand where it comes from. This observer consciousness is a hallmark of genuine healing. It's the beginning of what Jung called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are, a union of opposites, a reconciliation between your conscious personality and the vastness of your unconscious. To reach this state, you must go through discomfort. The unconscious will test you with dreams, conflicts, and synchronicities. It will bring up what you've avoided for years. But each time you confront a painful truth without collapsing, your psyche becomes more whole. You evolve from a reactive ego into an aware being. The unconscious as a guide, not an enemy, healing more than you realize often means you've stopped fighting your own inner life. Most people treat their emotions like intruders. Anxiety must be eliminated, sadness must be suppressed, anger must be denied. But Jung argued that the unconscious communicates through these very emotions. They are not enemies, they are messages. When you finally listen to them instead of silencing them, you begin to collaborate with your unconscious rather than resist it. You ask, "What are you trying to tell me?" For example, recurring anxiety might be the psyche's way of saying, "You're living a life that's not aligned with your truth." Depression might be the soul's protest against superficial goals. Anger might reveal where your boundaries were violated long ago. The moment you interpret symptoms as symbols, the healing accelerates. Jung's approach to therapy wasn't about fixing the symptom, it was about decoding it. Every emotional pattern, every dream, every trigger carries symbolic meaning. They are doors to the unconscious leading you back to yourself. Dreams, the language of healing. In Jung's view, dreams are not random brain noise, they are the language of the soul. When someone begins to heal more than they realize, their dreams often become clearer, more symbolic, sometimes even luminous. You might dream of water, the archetypal symbol of the unconscious. You might dream of old houses, broken mirrors, or dark tunnels. Each of these images carries psychological meaning. A dream of descending into a cave, for instance, can symbolize your journey into the shadow. A dream of climbing a mountain may represent your movement toward integration and enlightenment. Jungian healing is not linear. It's cyclical, symbolic, and deeply personal. Dreams often reveal progress before your conscious mind notices it. You might still feel lost or unsure, but your inner world shows that you're already transforming. When you take time to record, reflect, and analyze your dreams, you're engaging in an ancient dialogue between your conscious ego and the deeper self. That dialogue is the foundation of healing because the self, not the ego, knows what you truly need. Pain as a portal to wholeness healing doesn't mean the absence of pain. It means the transformation of your relationship with pain. For Jung, pain was sacred. It was the fire through which the ego is purified. When you experience deep suffering, something within you breaks, but that breaking opens space for consciousness to enter. Jung called this process the transcendent function, the tension between opposites, suffering and acceptance, light and dark ego, and self gives birth to something new. In modern terms, you could say pain is a portal. It strips away illusion, pride, and denial. It forces you to meet your soul. If you've reached a point where you can feel pain without labeling it as punishment, where you can say, "This is teaching me," then you have healed more than you realize. Because your psyche has begun to transform suffering into meaning, and meaning is the essence of Jungian healing. Synchronicity and the signs of inner order. As you begin to integrate your unconscious, you might notice that the outer world seems to mirror your inner process. You encounter meaningful coincidences, people, phrases, or events that feel too precise to be random. Jung called this synchronicity the phenomenon where inner states and external events align with symbolic meaning. For instance, you may think about forgiveness, and a stranger mentions forgiveness moments later. Or you might dream of water, and then wake to rain. These synchronicities are not magical thinking. They are signs that your inner and outer worlds are aligning, that your psyche is becoming ordered. When the unconscious and conscious start working together, life feels guided. You stop chasing signs and start living in alignment with them. That sense of harmony is a deep indicator that you've already healed more than you thought. Acceptance is a sign of deep healing. Healing begins in the unconscious, but it manifests as acceptance in daily life. Acceptance is not resignation. It's the recognition that every emotion, every memory, every part of your story belongs. Nothing has to be erased. You no longer divide your experiences into good and bad. Instead, you see how each played a role in your growth. You can remember your past without shame. You can meet others' flaws without judgment. You begin to see the world with compassionate neutrality, an attitude Jung associated with the mature soul. When you can hold contradiction without collapsing, When you can live with uncertainty and still trust life, you're living from a healed psyche, because you've integrated opposites within yourself, and that is the essence of individuation. From projection to ownership. A major sign that healing has begun deep inside is when you take back your projections. Jung said that we project our own unconscious contents onto others, our fears, desires, and insecurities. That's why we're drawn to or repelled by certain people. They mirror what we've disowned within ourselves. When you're unhealed, you keep saying, "They made me angry, they betrayed me, they're toxic." But when healing starts, you begin to say, "Why did I react so strongly? What part of me is being mirrored here?" This shift from blame to ownership marks a profound transformation. You no longer see yourself as a victim of life, but as a participant in your own psychological evolution. You start to retrieve the energy you've been giving away through judgment and resentment. That reclaimed energy becomes your creative power. As Jung would say, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The symbolic death and rebirth healing in the unconscious often involves a symbolic death, the death of an old identity, belief, or attachment. Jung compared this to the alchemical process of transformation, where the base material, the raw ego, must be dissolved before it can become gold, the self. You might go through periods of emptiness, confusion, or loss of purpose. These are not regressions. They are the natural dismantling of outdated psychic structures. When you stop clinging to who you were, space opens for who you're meant to become. If you've gone through such dark nights and come out more compassionate, more aware, more present, even if you still feel fragile, you have already healed more than you realize. Because what has died is illusion, and what remains is truth. Integration over perfection. Jung warned that the goal of healing is not to become perfect, but to become whole. Perfection belongs to the ego's fantasy. Wholeness belongs to the soul. When you realize that healing isn't about erasing pain but integrating it, you stop chasing idealized happiness. You learn to coexist with imperfection. You find beauty in the cracks, meaning in the scars. You stop needing to be healed because you already are. You just continue evolving toward greater integration. A healed person still feels sadness, but they no longer drown in it. They still encounter fear, but they see it as guidance, not doom. They still remember the past, but it no longer defines the future. In this quiet, humble state of awareness, the unconscious no longer rules from the shadows, it collaborates with your consciousness. And that partnership between the seen and unseen is what Jung called psychological maturity. Living the mystery. Perhaps the most profound sign that healing has taken root is your comfort with mystery. You no longer demand absolute answers from life. You can sit in the unknown without panic. You trust that the unconscious, the vast intelligence beneath thought, knows what it's doing. You surrender control without giving up agency. You flow without apathy. You engage life as a dialogue between your inner world and the outer world. Jung once wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Healing is that privilege in motion. It's the unfolding of your true nature through the chaos of human experience. So if lately you've been calmer, more observant, less reactive, if you've started to notice your dreams, to see patterns, to understand your pain without bitterness, then your soul has already been healing in the background. The unconscious has been doing its quiet work, patiently guiding you toward wholeness. Healing doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It whispers through subtle peace, through patience, where anger used to live, through clarity, where confusion once ruled. That is the silent miracle of the unconscious, the invisible work that turns suffering into wisdom. And that's where every true healing begins. Part 2. Emotional integration. When emotions are no longer the enemy. When Jung spoke about the human psyche, he saw it as a living organism that constantly strives toward balance. The conscious mind and the unconscious are not separate enemies. They are two halves of the same soul. But when one half dominates, the other rebels. The conflict we feel inside, the anxiety, sadness, anger, guilt, is not dysfunction. It's communication. The unconscious speaks through emotion. When you've healed more than you realize, one of the clearest signs is that you've stopped treating your emotions like intruders. You no longer see them as problems to be fixed, but as teachers to be understood. You start to feel without collapsing. You observe without judging. And in that subtle inner shift, you cross a psychological threshold Jung considered sacred, the integration of emotion into consciousness. Emotion as the language of the soul. In Jungian psychology, emotions are not random biochemical reactions, they are symbolic messengers from the unconscious. Every feeling has meaning, even if the mind cannot yet articulate it. When we repress or numb emotions, we silence the voice of the psyche itself. Jung believed that what you resist persists because the emotion you suppress doesn't die. It burrows deeper and gains energy in the unconscious until it demands attention. Healing begins when we stop silencing that voice. A healed person no longer says, "I shouldn't feel this way," but rather, "Why do I feel this way?" That curiosity marks the evolution from emotional immaturity to psychological awareness. Anger, for instance, is not evil. It's the psyche's alarm system telling you that your boundaries were crossed. Sadness is not weakness, it's grief calling for acknowledgement. Even jealousy can reveal where you've disowned your own desires. Once you decode the symbolic message behind an emotion, you transform it. You turn raw affect into insight. When you begin to integrate emotion consciously, you no longer drown in your feelings, you digest them. Like food, emotion nourishes or poisons depending on whether it's processed consciously. Integration is the digestion of the soul. From emotional suppression to emotional dialogue. Most people grow up learning to suppress emotion. We're told not to cry, not to be angry, not to show weakness. Society conditions us to believe that emotional expression is a sign of instability, but Jung understood that repression is the root of neurosis. Every unexpressed emotion becomes psychic energy trapped in the unconscious. Over time, that energy manifests as anxiety, chronic fatigue, or unexplained sadness. When healing occurs even unconsciously, you begin to dialogue with your emotions instead of suppressing them. You realize they have intelligence. For example, instead of numbing sadness with distractions, you sit with it. You listen. You ask, "What are you trying to show me?" And something incredible happens. The emotion begins to soften. It loses its charge. You start to feel peace in the very place where you once felt pain. That's not coincidence. That's transformation. In Jungian terms, you've allowed the emotion to complete its symbolic function, to carry the message from the unconscious into consciousness. Once delivered, it no longer needs to haunt you. This is why Jung believed that emotions are not to be solved, but understood. The problem is not that you feel too much, it's that you haven't yet learned to listen deeply enough. The dance between anima and animus. Jung introduced two archetypes, the anima and animus, to describe the inner feminine and masculine aspects of every psyche. The anima represents feeling, intuition, and receptivity. The animus represents logic, will, and structure. Healing emotionally means these two energies stop fighting and start dancing. When you're unhealed, you tend to polarize. You either over-identify with the rational mind suppressing emotion and intuition, or you drown in emotion, losing structure and direction. But when you begin to integrate, you develop harmony between heart and mind. The anima no longer overwhelms you, and the animus no longer silences you. This inner marriage is not metaphorical, it's experiential. You can feel it. Your reactions slow down. You pause before responding. You think, but you also feel. You lead with clarity without losing compassion. Jung saw this union as essential for individuation because only a psyche that unites its masculine and feminine aspects can express its full humanity. If you found yourself becoming less reactive, more intuitive, yet still grounded, if you can empathize without losing your boundaries, it's a sign that your inner anima and animus are finally working together. That's emotional integration at its finest. Owning your emotional shadow. Emotional healing is impossible without confronting the emotional shadow, the feelings we've been taught to deny. These are the forbidden emotions: rage, envy, shame, lust, or the hunger for power. Most people bury them under moral labels, believing they're bad. But Jung warned that the repressed shadow doesn't disappear. It becomes projected. We begin to see in others what we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. When you heal, you begin to reclaim these emotions as part of your humanity. You can admit, yes, I feel envy sometimes. Yes, I feel rage. Yes, I crave control. And instead of judging yourself, you get curious. What does this emotion reveal about me? What wound does it point to? That self-honesty breaks the chain of projection. You stop blaming others for what you haven't integrated. You realize that behind every negative emotion is a disowned truth. Envy hides unlived potential. Rage hides violated boundaries. Shame hides an unhealed wound. Owning your emotional shadow is not self-indulgence, it's responsibility. You stop outsourcing your emotional growth to others. You become the parent your inner child never had, one who says, "You can feel whatever you feel, and I will not abandon you for it." That internal stance of radical acceptance is the foundation of deep emotional maturity. Emotional regulation through awareness, not control. A common misconception about healing is that it means you'll never feel intense emotion again. But Jungian healing doesn't eliminate emotion, it transforms your relationship to it. The goal isn't control, it's awareness. When you're unhealed, you either repress or explode. You react impulsively because the emotion owns you. But when healing begins, you become aware in real time of what's happening inside. You feel the anger rise, and instead of being possessed by it, you breathe. You watch it. You choose. That is consciousness in motion. Jung would call this the moment the ego stops being the puppet of the unconscious. You've integrated enough awareness to hold the tension between impulse and reflection. Imagine your psyche as a container. Before healing, that container was fragile. It couldn't hold strong emotion, so it shattered easily. After integration, the container expands. You can hold sadness, anger, fear, love, all at once without losing yourself. That's emotional resilience born of awareness. You don't suppress and you don't indulge. You feel, understand, and release. It's not control through force. It's control through understanding. And that difference changes everything. Forgiveness as emotional liberation. Forgiveness is often misunderstood as forgetting the harm done. Jung would define it differently as the release of psychic energy trapped in resentment. When you can forgive not out of weakness but awareness, you stop feeding the emotional loops that drain your vitality. Resentment is a form of psychic possession. The mind replays the same wound over and over because the unconscious seeks closure. But true closure never comes through revenge or avoidance. It comes when you integrate the emotion. You don't have to excuse what happened. You simply stop identifying with the pain. You allow it to exist without letting it define you. If you've reached a point where you can remember the person who hurt you and feel neutrality, neither hatred nor longing, that's not indifference. That's healing. That's the psyche reclaiming energy that was trapped in emotional fixation. Forgiveness in Jungian terms is the moment the self absorbs the wound and transforms it into wisdom. It's not the end of the story. It's the beginning of freedom. Emotions as alchemy. Jung often compared psychological transformation to alchemy, the ancient art of turning base metal into gold. In alchemy, the raw material is impure, chaotic, and volatile, much like our emotions. Through heat containment and patience, the substance transforms into something refined. Your emotions are the same. Anger, fear, shame, these are your raw materials. Through the fire of awareness, they become compassion, courage, and humility. The alchemical vessel is your consciousness. The heat is your willingness to feel. When you stop fleeing discomfort, you activate this alchemical process naturally. The psyche knows how to heal if you let it work. The only thing it needs is your attention. So when you find yourself crying unexpectedly or feeling deep emotions without a clear reason, don't panic. Something ancient within you is being purified. Jung said that the process of individuation requires holding the tension of opposites. That means staying present with both pain and peace, fear and faith until a higher synthesis emerges. That synthesis is emotional integration. When empathy expands. As emotional integration deepens, empathy becomes more natural, not forced, not performative, but organic. You understand suffering because you've faced your own. You stop judging others by their behavior alone. You sense the unconscious motives behind it. You see that anger often hides fear, arrogance hides insecurity, silence hides pain. This awareness doesn't make you naive, it makes you wise. You can discern manipulation without losing compassion. You can protect yourself without closing your heart. This is what Jung referred to as psychological differentiation, the ability to feel deeply without losing clarity. You no longer absorb others' emotions unconsciously. You sense them, name them, and return to center. For empaths, especially this stage of healing is life-changing. You realize that empathy doesn't mean carrying everyone's pain, it means understanding it and choosing your boundaries consciously. You love others without abandoning yourself. If you've reached a stage where your empathy feels peaceful rather than exhausting, that's a sign of profound integration. You've learned to feel without losing form. Emotional honesty and authentic expression. In Jungian, healing authenticity is the final proof of integration. When you can express emotion truthfully without exaggeration or suppression, you've reached emotional balance. Authentic expression doesn't mean dramatic expression. It means that your inner state and your outer behavior align. You no longer say, "I'm fine," when you're not. You no longer pretend to love when you feel resentment. You no longer fake strength to hide vulnerability. This alignment between feeling and expression restores integrity to the psyche. Jung called this psychic congruence, when your conscious attitude reflects the truth of your inner world. You begin to communicate with emotional clarity. You say, "I'm hurt, but I still care." You say, "I'm scared, but I'll try." This kind of emotional transparency creates genuine connection. People feel safe around authenticity because it resonates with their own buried truth. If you've noticed that your relationships are becoming more real, fewer games, fewer power struggles, it's not luck. It's a reflection of your emotional integration. The outer mirrors the inner. The serenity that follows understanding. Once emotions are integrated, life doesn't become emotionless, it becomes serene. Serenity is not apathy, it's a stable emotional field. You can experience turbulence without being swept away. This serenity is what many spiritual traditions call equanimity. Jung saw it as the fruit of individuation, the balance between conscious and unconscious heart and mind, emotion and reason. You no longer chase emotional highs or fear emotional lows. You allow the full weather of human feeling to pass through without identifying with every storm. That's psychological freedom. People might even say, "You seem so calm lately." They don't see that this calmness isn't detachment. It's the peace that comes from finally being at home within your own psyche. The emotional noise has quieted not because you've silenced it, but because you've listened to it so deeply that it no longer needs to scream. The integration of compassion, a healed emotional life, always culminates in compassion not just for others, but for yourself. You look back at the version of you who suffered, who reacted, who lashed out, and you feel tenderness instead of shame. You understand now that every overreaction was a defense, every mistake was an attempt to survive. Compassion is the proof that you've integrated your emotional shadow, because compassion requires that you see your darkness and still love yourself. Jung once said, "The acceptance of oneself is the essence of the whole moral problem." Emotional healing is the practice of that acceptance in real time. You no longer punish yourself for being human. You allow emotions to come and go like weather, trusting that none of them define your worth. When compassion becomes your default response to yourself first, then to others, your emotions are no longer your enemy. They've become your allies in the journey toward wholeness. Emotional integration as the gateway to the self. In Jung's model, the ultimate purpose of emotional integration is to prepare the ego for the emergence of the self, the archetype of totality. The self can only manifest when the ego has learned humility through feeling. If you've faced your sadness without collapsing, If you've held your anger without acting destructively, if you've allowed fear to coexist with courage, you've already been trained by the unconscious for this next stage. Emotions once chaotic and painful now serve as bridges between the personal and the transpersonal. They connect your human story to the universal patterns of life. You realize that every emotion, joy, grief, rage, awe, is part of the larger dance of existence. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is wrong. This realization is freedom. You no longer chase only positive emotions. You embrace the totality of being. That is what Jung meant by becoming whole. And when you live from that wholeness, emotions cease to dominate you, they illuminate you. They become the colors through which consciousness paints the soul's evolution. Part 3. The ego surrenders when you no longer need to prove your worth. There comes a point in every person's inner journey when the constant noise of self-defense begins to fade. You no longer feel compelled to explain yourself, to convince anyone of your goodness, or to chase validation. Something in you relaxes, not out of defeat, but out of awakening. Carl Jung would call this moment the ego's surrender, the quiet turning point when the conscious self recognizes it is not the center of the universe, but a servant of something deeper, wiser, and infinitely larger, the self. Healing in Jung's view is not about becoming more perfect. It's about loosening the tyranny of the ego so that the self can emerge. When you've healed more than you realize, you stop identifying so completely with the fragile mask of I. You no longer need to prove your worth through achievements, relationships, or appearances. You realize that worth was never something to earn, it was something you already were. The ego's need for control. At its core, the ego's mission is survival. It's not evil, it's necessary. The ego gives structure, identity, and boundaries to the human experience. Without it, we dissolve into chaos. But what begins as protection easily turns into possession. The ego begins to believe it is the whole self rather than just a part. When the ego dominates, life becomes a performance. Every action, every word, every decision is motivated by a hidden question. Will this make me worthy? You may chase success, love, or recognition, but behind it all lies fear, the fear of being nothing without validation. Jung saw this as the inflation of the ego, a psychological inflation that disconnects us from the unconscious and therefore from the soul. The ego believes it must control life to be safe. But healing begins when that illusion collapses, when you realize that control is impossible and unnecessary. When life humbles you, when failure, loss, or rejection strip away your masks, you meet the truth. The ego can no longer sustain its story. You realize that everything you've tried to build for validation was already temporary. What remains is what's real. The moment of surrender doesn't mean passivity. It means trusting the inner order more than the outer plan. It means recognizing that your conscious will is not the ultimate authority. The ego doesn't disappear, it learns to bow. This surrender is often preceded by crisis. Jung observed that when the ego becomes too rigid, life finds a way to break it open. A failed relationship, a betrayal, an illness, these are not punishments, they're invitations. The unconscious uses them to restore balance. When you've healed more than you realize, you begin to interpret these breakdowns differently. You see them not as personal failures, but as the psyche's attempt to wake you up. You start saying, maybe this isn't happening to me, but for me. That shift in perception signals that the ego is no longer in charge. The deeper self has begun to guide your interpretation of life. You can feel this shift in your body, less tension, less resistance, more flow. You don't fight every challenge. You allow life to unfold even when you don't understand it. And paradoxically, that surrender brings a quiet strength far greater than the ego's constant struggle. The death of the old identity. When Jung described the process of individuation, he compared it to death and rebirth. Not physical death, but psychological. The death of old identities that once defined you. Maybe you were the achiever, the caretaker, the perfectionist, the hero, the victim. These roles once served you. They helped you survive. But healing reveals that you are not any of these masks. You are the consciousness behind them. When those identities fall away, it feels like loss. You may go through confusion, emptiness, or even despair. But Jung would assure you that this emptiness is sacred. It's the space in which the self is born. The ego mourns the loss of identity, but the soul celebrates the return to truth. You begin to sense that who you are cannot be reduced to labels. You're not your trauma, your achievements, or your social image. You are the silent awareness witnessing it all. And when that realization stabilizes, external approval loses its grip. You stop chasing. You start being. The end of comparison. One of the surest signs that the ego has begun to surrender is the end of comparison. You stop measuring yourself against others. You no longer need to be better, smarter, richer, or more spiritual than anyone. Jung would say this is the moment when you stop identifying with the persona, the mask you wear in society. The persona is useful. It helps us adapt. But when you confuse the mask for the self, you live in constant tension. Every interaction becomes a subtle competition. Healing brings freedom from that tension. You can admire someone's beauty without feeling inferior. You can witness someone's success without envy. You understand that each person's journey unfolds according to their inner blueprint. In the collective unconscious, Jung saw humanity as a vast web of interconnected archetypes, each playing a role in the greater drama of evolution. When you realize this, comparison becomes meaningless. You see that your path is not supposed to look like anyone else's. The ego thrives on separation, the self thrives on connection. When you begin to feel genuine joy for others' growth, you've already transcended the ego's boundaries. The stillness beyond reaction. When the ego is dominant, life feels like constant reaction. Someone criticizes you, you defend yourself. Someone ignores you, you feel invisible. Someone outshines you, you feel diminished. The ego reacts because it lives on borrowed identity. It cannot stand still without validation. But as the ego surrenders, a stillness arises. You no longer react to every stimulus. You observe. You feel the impulse to defend yourself, and then you don't. You sense the urge to prove, and you let it dissolve. This stillness is not numbness, it's presence. It's the mind resting in itself. Jung saw this as the result of ego. Self-alignment, when the conscious mind learns to trust the deeper wisdom of the unconscious. In this stillness, you no longer chase meaning, you embody it. Silence becomes rich. Solitude becomes nurturing. You no longer fear being misunderstood because you no longer depend on being understood. You know that truth doesn't need witnesses. The freedom of not needing to impress. The ego thrives on performance. It builds identity through roles, the good person, the intelligent one, the strong one, the humble one. But when you start to heal, you grow tired of playing roles. You just want to be real. That's when authenticity begins, not as rebellion, but as release. You no longer need to impress. You speak when you have something meaningful to say, not to fill silence. You dress, act, and live in ways that feel genuine, not strategic. Jung believed that authenticity is not a personality trait, it's a byproduct of integration. When you integrate the shadow, you don't need to hide your flaws or exaggerate your virtues. You know that light and dark coexist in everyone. If you've found yourself more comfortable with imperfection, if you can admit mistakes, laugh at your past selves, and speak from vulnerability, your ego has already softened. You've entered the realm of real confidence, quiet, steady, unprovable. Humility as strength. In Jungian psychology, humility is not self-deprecation, it's psychological balance. It means knowing your limits without shame and your strengths without arrogance. The healed ego doesn't shrink, it aligns. Humility allows you to listen. When you no longer need to be right, you can actually learn. When you no longer need to dominate, you can truly connect. Jung observed that humility often arrives through suffering. Life humbles us, so we can remember what we are and what we are not. When illness, loss, or betrayal strip away illusions, humility fills the space where pride used to be. A humble person doesn't pretend to know everything. They trust the mystery. They allow the unknown to be. And that surrender paradoxically brings a profound sense of security. Because when you stop pretending to be in control, you finally feel held by something greater. The solitude that feels like home. Another unmistakable sign that the ego has surrendered is your relationship with solitude. What once felt like loneliness now feels like peace. You no longer seek constant stimulation or validation. You enjoy your own company. Jung would say this happens because your inner world has become rich enough to sustain you. You've reconnected with the unconscious, the dream world, the imagination, the symbolic realm. You're no longer dependent on the outer world to fill inner emptiness. Solitude becomes sacred. You use it to listen, to create, to commune with the self. The absence of noise becomes nourishment. You begin to understand why mystics, artists, and thinkers have always sought solitude, not to escape the world, but to hear its deeper music. When you reach this stage, you're not isolating out of fear. You're resting in authenticity. You no longer need constant external mirrors because you've found the mirror within the reflection of your own soul. The shift from achievement to alignment. Unhealed egos chase achievement. Healed souls seek alignment. The difference is subtle but life-changing. Achievement is about proving your worth. Alignment is about expressing your essence. You no longer set goals to impress others. You ask, what feels true, what brings peace? You still strive, but your striving is joyful, not anxious. You work with life, not against it. Jung described this as the transition from ambition to vocation. A vocation is not just a career, it's a calling from the self. When you align with it, life stops feeling like struggle. Effort becomes expression. If you've noticed that you no longer crave recognition the way you once did, but instead feel satisfaction in authenticity, your ego has begun to dissolve. You're no longer driven by insecurity, you're guided by meaning. Detachment from outcome. The surrendered ego releases the obsession with outcomes. It doesn't mean you stop caring, it means you no longer tie your identity to results. Whether you succeed or fail, you remain the same. This detachment is not apathy, it's trust. It's the realization that you can give your best and let go. The universe, the self, or whatever you call it, will handle the rest. Jung wrote that the purpose of life is not happiness, but meaning. And meaning often emerges in the spaces where control ends. When you let go of how things should be, you make room for what wants to be. If you can now approach your dreams with passion but without desperation, if you can care deeply while staying at peace, that's a sign your ego has surrendered to the flow of the self. The quiet confidence of being. When the ego surrenders, confidence changes form. It's no longer loud or performative. It's quiet, rooted, and serene. You no longer need to announce your worth because your presence speaks for itself. This confidence doesn't come from superiority but from self-knowledge. You know your weaknesses, but they don't shame you. You know your gifts, but they don't inflate you. You are simply yourself without pretense. Jung would say this is what it means to stand in your own light. Not the light of comparison, but the inner radiance of authenticity. People sense it. They feel calm around you because you carry no agenda. You're not trying to impress or manipulate. You're simply being. That kind of presence has magnetic power, the power of the integrated soul. The ego as servant, not master. In the end, the goal is not to destroy the ego, but to redeem it. The ego's surrender transforms it from tyrant to servant. It becomes the vessel through which the self expresses itself in the world. You still use your intellect, your will, your personality, but now they serve consciousness, not insecurity. The ego becomes translucent, like a window through which light can pass. Jung wrote, "The ego must yield to the self, but it must not be destroyed. Because without the ego, there is no individuality. Healing is not ego death, it's ego integration. When you reach this balance, you live in harmony with the forces within you. The conscious and the unconscious cooperate. The self that once sought validation now seeks expression. You act not from fear, but from authenticity. And that, Jung would say, is the moment you begin to live from the center, not from the surface. You stop arguing with reality. A surrendered ego stops arguing with life. You accept things as they are, not as you wish they were. That doesn't mean resignation. It means clarity. You recognize that resistance doesn't change reality. It only prolongs suffering. You begin to practice radical acceptance, not as a technique, but as a natural outcome of wisdom. When something painful happens, your first instinct is no longer, "Why me?" but "What is this showing me?" You see every situation as an opportunity for awareness. Even chaos becomes meaningful when viewed from the perspective of the self. You don't force life into linear order. You trust its circular rhythm. You stop demanding certainty and instead cultivate faith. Faith not in dogma, but in direct experience. If you can look back on events that once devastated you and feel gratitude for their lessons, you've witnessed the ego's surrender firsthand. Peace as the new ambition. When the ego is healed, peace replaces ambition. Not the peace of passivity, but the peace of presence. You no longer chase highs or escape lows. You live rhythmically in harmony with life's seasons. You can work hard and rest deeply. You can love fiercely and let go gracefully. You can give without losing and receive without guilt. This peace doesn't come from avoiding the world, but from integrating it. You've accepted both your human limits and your divine potential. You no longer fight who you are, and therefore you no longer fight life. Jung described this as the integration of opposites, the union of the finite and the infinite within one being. When the ego bows to the self, peace is inevitable, the lightness of being. After surrender, life feels lighter. You don't carry stories of injustice or self-importance anymore. You forgive faster, laugh easier, and recover more quickly. You're not chasing an identity. You're living an experience. Even suffering changes tone. It no longer feels like punishment, but like refinement. You begin to see everything: joy, pain, love, loss as part of the same dance. You realize that the ego was never the enemy. It was just scared. And healing is not about killing it, but comforting it until it relaxes. When it does, you finally feel free, free not from life, but within it. Part 4. The integration of the self, the soul that has found meaning in pain. When you've walked through enough darkness, something shifts inside you. The pain that once seemed meaningless begins to feel sacred. The chaos that once shattered you becomes the ground upon which your soul stands taller. This is what Carl Jung called the integration of the self, the moment when the fragments of your psyche, once scattered by trauma and illusion, begin to align into wholeness. The self in Jung's analytical psychology is not the ego. It is the totality of your being, the union of the conscious and the unconscious, the divine and the human, the wounded and the wise. It's the archetype of completeness, the image of God within the soul. When you reach this level of healing, your life is no longer driven by fear or ambition. It is guided by meaning. You've become what Jung described as a symbol of the self in motion, a human being who has remembered they are both matter and spirit. The meaning hidden inside suffering. Jung believed that the greatest discoveries of the soul often happen in the darkest hours. He wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." Most people run from suffering, but those who dare to confront it begin to see that it carries meaning. When you've healed more than you realize, you stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and start asking, "What is this teaching me?" That shift is not intellectual, it's alchemical. Pain, when consciously faced, becomes a crucible for transformation. It burns away illusions, pride, and superficial desires until only truth remains. Suffering, in Jung's view, is the soul's way of demanding attention. It is the unconscious knocking on the door of consciousness saying, "There's something you need to see." When you finally open that door, you discover that the pain was never an enemy, it was a messenger. You begin to realize that every heartbreak, every betrayal, every loss was not random. It was shaping you into the person capable of carrying your true purpose. Pain carved the vessel through which wisdom could flow. When you look back and see how the worst moments led to your deepest understanding, that's the self integrating. Meaning has entered where chaos once ruled. The self as the inner healer. In analytical psychology, the self is not just a concept, it's an active force within you. Jung saw it as a guiding intelligence that orchestrates your growth through both conscious choices and unconscious events. It's as if there's a divine compass buried deep in your psyche, gently steering you toward wholeness even when you resist. You can feel its presence in synchronicities, dreams, and intuition. It's the quiet voice that whispers, "This is not the end even when you're broken." It's the mysterious order that brings the right person, the right book, or the right moment at exactly the right time. When you're still ruled by the ego, you mistake this guidance for luck or coincidence. But once you begin to integrate the self, you recognize it as inner orchestration, your soul collaborating with life. Healing then becomes less about effort and more about alignment. You stop forcing things to happen. You start listening. You realize that life unfolds with a kind of hidden benevolence, not always easy, not always painless, but always purposeful. That's when the self begins to lead and the ego begins to follow. Wholeness, not perfection. One of Jung's most profound insights was that healing is not about becoming perfect, it's about becoming whole. Perfection belongs to the ego's fantasy. Wholeness belongs to the soul's reality. When you integrate the self, you stop dividing yourself into good and bad, light and dark. You accept that both coexist within you. You no longer seek to erase your flaws, but to understand their meaning. The anger you once condemned becomes a signal of violated truth. The fear you once hated becomes an invitation to trust. Even your mistakes begin to reveal hidden wisdom. Wholeness is radical acceptance. It's the moment you realize that you were never broken, you were fragmented, and every fragment had a reason for existing. Each wound carried a lesson. Each shadow held a piece of power. You begin to live with paradox. You can be peaceful and passionate, soft and strong, humble and bold all at once. You stop needing to define yourself because you finally contain yourself. In Jung's terms, the opposites have reconciled. Conscious and unconscious ego and self, heaven and earth, they no longer fight, they converse. Dreams as the bridge of integration. As integration deepens, your dreams often become more vivid, symbolic, and coherent. Jung called dreams the royal road to the unconscious, but at this stage they become the royal road to the self. You may dream of circles, mandalas, or luminous figures, all symbols of wholeness. You may dream of water that once flooded, now becoming calm and reflective, symbolizing emotional balance. You may dream of climbing mountains, walking through tunnels, or meeting wise strangers, all signs of psychic transformation. Dreams show you that your inner world has begun to organize itself. The chaos that once dominated has turned into structure. Your psyche is no longer fragmented, it's harmonizing. By reflecting on these dreams not as random stories but as sacred messages, you deepen your dialogue with the self. Every night your soul speaks in metaphor. Every morning you have the chance to listen. The more you listen, the more the unconscious collaborates. You start to feel like life itself is dreaming through you. That's integration. The union of opposites. Jung saw the entire process of individuation and therefore healing as the union of opposites. Every conflict you face, every tension you endure, serves a purpose to reveal a greater synthesis waiting to emerge. Light cannot exist without shadow. Strength means nothing without vulnerability. Freedom has no meaning without boundaries. When you've integrated the self, you stop seeking extremes. You live from the center, what Jung called the transcendent function. You can hold joy and sorrow without contradiction. You can honor your desires without being enslaved by them. You can face your fear without losing courage. This union doesn't make life easier, but it makes it meaningful. You stop swinging between guilt and pride, between control and chaos. You find the middle space, not lukewarm neutrality, but conscious balance. That's what it means to live as an integrated being. You no longer identify with one pole of experience. You embody both. You don't need to choose between spirit and flesh, heaven and earth, love and solitude. You live as their meeting point. You've become, as Jung would say, a bridge between worlds. When you begin to see the divine in the mundane, integration changes perception. Ordinary life no longer feels ordinary. The sacred is everywhere, in silence, in laughter, in pain, in dust. You start to see how every event, no matter how small, carries symbolic weight. The conversation with a stranger, the sudden song you hear on the street, the storm that forces you to stay inside, all become mirrors of your inner state. You realize that life doesn't just happen to you, it happens through you. The line between the inner world and the outer world begins to dissolve. You recognize that the unconscious doesn't only speak in dreams, it speaks in life itself. This is what Jung called synchronicity, the meaningful coincidence that reveals an underlying order. When the self integrates, synchronicity becomes a way of life. You stop calling them coincidences, you call them confirmations. The divine no longer feels distant. It's woven into everything, even into the brokenness, especially into the brokenness. Compassion as the fruit of integration. Once the self integrates, your relationship to others transforms. You no longer project your unhealed parts onto them. You see through the masks and the defenses, not with judgment but with compassion. You can look at someone's cruelty and sense the fear behind it. You can witness someone's arrogance and feel the insecurity that drives it. You can even see your younger self in those who still struggle. This doesn't mean you tolerate toxicity. It means you no longer meet darkness with hate. You meet it with understanding. You can set boundaries without bitterness. You can forgive without forgetting. Compassion in Jungian psychology is not sentimentality, it's awareness. It's the recognition that everyone is living out their own dialogue between ego and self, shadow and light. When you see others this way, you stop needing to change them. You simply become a mirror of consciousness, a quiet example of what integration looks like. That's how healing spreads, not by preaching but by presence. Gratitude for the journey. Another unmistakable sign of integration is gratitude, not for just the good, but for everything. You begin to thank life not only for blessings, but for wounds. You remember the moments you begged for relief, and now you thank them for the strength they built. You remember the people who left, and you thank them for showing you that your worth doesn't depend on being chosen. Gratitude at this level is not forced positivity, it's clarity. You see how every thread in the tapestry of your life had its place. Nothing was wasted. Jung said that meaning is what heals the soul. Gratitude is meaning, realized the soul, saying, "Now I understand." It's the peace that comes not from erasing the past, but from embracing it fully. When gratitude arises naturally without effort, you know the self has taken root. You no longer chase healing because you've become healing itself. The integration of spirit and matter. For Jung, one of the most profound aspects of the self is that it unites the spiritual and the physical. He rejected the idea that enlightenment meant escaping the body or transcending the world. Instead, he saw individuation as the incarnation of spirit into matter, the divine made visible through the human form. You don't have to withdraw into monasteries or detach from life to be spiritual. You bring the divine into the marketplace, into relationships, into creativity, into imperfection. You live the sacred while washing dishes, working or grieving. When the self integrates, everything becomes sacred work. Every moment becomes an altar. Every breath becomes prayer. You stop dividing your existence into spiritual and mundane. You see that both are the same dance, the spirit expressing itself through the material. Jung believed that when this happens, the individual becomes a vessel of light in the collective darkness. You're not trying to escape the world, you're helping to redeem it simply by living consciously within it, living from the center. In the integrated state, you no longer live from reaction, fear, or desire. You live from the center, the still point where all opposites meet. This center is not static, it's dynamic like the calm eye within a storm. From this place you can engage with life fully while remaining inwardly grounded. You act, but you're not attached. You feel deeply, but you're not consumed. Jung compared this state to a mandala, a circular symbol representing the self. When you live from the center, your life forms its own mandala. Everything revolves around purpose rather than chaos. Decisions become intuitive. Relationships become conscious. Work becomes meaningful. Even conflict becomes creative tension rather than destruction. From the center, you no longer need to ask, "What should I do?" You simply know. The self guides you through intuition, synchronicity, and inner peace. It's not about control, it's about cooperation with your own soul. The quiet joy of wholeness. After the integration of the self, joy returns not as excitement, but as quiet contentment. It's not the joy of getting what you want, it's the joy of realizing you already have what you need. This joy is steady, calm, and unshakable, because it doesn't depend on circumstance. It comes from harmony between your conscious and unconscious, between who you are and who you were meant to be. You wake up grateful for no reason. You walk slower. You listen more. You laugh without needing an audience. This is not naive happiness. It's existential joy born from having faced the abyss and discovered light within it. You realize that life will still hurt sometimes, but pain no longer threatens your peace. You've integrated it. You've learned that love and loss, growth and grief, creation and destruction are not enemies, they are rhythms of the same divine heartbeat. That's the ultimate freedom to live fully without needing life to be perfect. Becoming the symbol of wholeness, Jung believed that those who integrate the self become living symbols for others, not idols but mirrors. Their presence awakens something ancient in those around them, a remembrance of inner divinity. When you've reached this stage, you don't need to teach with words. Your very being becomes teaching. People feel safe around you because you radiate authenticity. You no longer project confusion. You project calm. You're not superior to anyone, you're simply whole. And wholeness has a quiet power. It heals by resonance. This is why Jung saw individuation not just as personal salvation, but as a contribution to collective evolution. Every person who integrates their self helps balance the psyche of humanity. You become part of the world's healing, not by preaching change, but by embodying it. Integration never ends. Even as you reach this point, Jung would remind you, integration is not a final destination. The self is infinite. Its depths are endless. You continue to evolve, to descend and rise again and again. Each new challenge brings new layers of awareness. Each loss opens a new doorway to meaning. Each mistake becomes another opportunity for compassion. Wholeness is not static, it's alive. It breathes through you, it transforms with you. And as long as you remain conscious, the dialogue between ego and self continues, not as war, but as dance. To live this way is to live in psychological grace, aware, open, grounded, and endlessly becoming. Healing doesn't mean your pain disappears, it means your pain has found its place. It's when every scar starts to whisper wisdom instead of sorrow. You no longer need to prove, to chase, or to hide. You've become whole, not perfect, but real. Remember Jung's words, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." So choose to live as the healed version of yourself, quietly, powerful, deeply human, infinitely whole. If this message resonates with your soul, don't forget to share it so someone else remembers their own healing too.